Hi, this is Michael from Neatline Antique Maps, and in this video I explore the history of the mapping of Arabia from Ptolemy to Niebuhr. Our emphasis here is on the European perspective, and I hope to do a video on the Islamic tradition in the future. The basic geography of Arabia consists of high mountains and plateaus along the western edge, which slope down towards inland deserts, the most famous of which is the Arabian Desert, the heart of which is the so-called empty quarter, one of the largest contiguous bodies of sand in the world. Sometime in the 2nd century CE, Claudius Ptolemy wrote a treatise on cartography, the only book on this subject to have survived from classical antiquity. It eventually made its way to Renaissance Europe, where scholars began to produce maps. Now, the Romans had built bases along the Arabian coasts, and the peninsula was well known in Ptolemy's time. But Ptolemy believed the Earth to be smaller than previous estimations and assumed Asia was much wider than it is. These errors warped the shape of Arabia, with too much space between the African coast of the Red Sea and the Persian side of the Persian Gulf. In the north of the Arabian Peninsula, where traders had good knowledge of the distance across, Ptolemy was able to plot the landmass with reasonable accuracy, but had to leave a wide stretch of water for the Gulf, the result being this almost schematic east-west rectangle for the Gulf. On the other hand, in the south, he knew from sailors that the entrances to the Red Sea and Gulf were narrow, and thus he had to distort and exaggerate the shape of the southern coast. In this comparison of an early Ptolemaic map and a modern satellite image, you can see the differences in shape and orientation of the Gulf and Red Sea. The Gulf with an elongated east-west orientation, and the exaggerated width of the Red Sea and how it is filled with random islands. Actually, the internal topography itself is not too bad. Ptolemy's got the mountains along the western edge of the peninsula more or less correct. The mountain ranges in the center are erroneous, but we will see worse. One thing Ptolemy has done is invent an Arabian water system that doesn't exist. I want to draw your attention especially to the depiction of a large lake fed by mountains. There is no such lake, but we will see that it is one of the most enduring errors on maps of Arabia. As for maps of other regions, Ptolemaic maps were the main production for the first half of the 16th century. So we see that whether it's the famous 1511 Sylvanus edition, the 1513 Waldseemüller, the various editions of Fries reduced Waldseemüller, or the myriad issues of Munster, the Arabian Peninsula always takes the same form more or less, is surrounded by coordinates, and Latin names are used, with the differences being only in how the features are stylized or the number of islands filling the seas or other embellishments. In short, this is the Ptolemaic tradition as represented by maps of Arabia, but the concept can be extrapolated to other regions. Now, appearing alongside this tradition, we start to get what are referred to as modern maps, maps that begin to incorporate new data to redraw the Ptolemaic productions. The first map maker to produce modern maps focused on Arabia is an Italian, Giacomo Gastaldi. The first a small map in 1548 and then a large one in 1561. You can see the geometry is much better, especially the Gulf and the Red Sea. The contiguous southern coastline is closer to reality, as is the S-curve of the Strait of Hormuz. And the surrounding islands are much more sophisticated than Ptolemy's random clusters. Gastaldi's map was without question the most influential map of the region of its time. It is certainly a major improvement in the basic outlines of the region. However, once you move inland from the coast, the topography is in some ways less accurate than Ptolemy. Gastaldi's mountain system is completely different. In fact, he has invented mountain ranges to divide each region from the next. It is almost like he wrote in the region labels and then drew the mountains around them. And he has also added even more fictitious watercourses than Ptolemy. Ptolemy's large lake has become two, with the original lake now emptying into the sea. As I mentioned, this is one of the more enduring errors on Arabian maps, lasting well into the 17th century, a persistence that reveals a lot about how maps were made and published. We've gone from the Ptolemaic notion of a separate interior lake fed from the mountains, to Gastaldi's double source lake draining to the sea, to a 17th century depiction common on Dutch maps of it draining into an open bay, to then a final iteration in which the lake and river are gone but the bay remains and is enlarged. In this way, an idea from the 2nd century has a remnant 1500 years later, And this is actually quite common on all types of maps. And to understand why, we must remember that these maps were the product of a publishing business, and that the two largest expenses for map publishers were survey and compilation. In order to cut down on the high costs of labor, map makers and publishers were often content to reproduce outdated material, sometimes making subtle updates to freshen the product without really improving the cartography itself. Or, in one of my favorite examples, here we have the depiction of Arabia on Ortelius's larger map of Asia, the first from 1570 and then another 5 years later, 1575. Focusing on Medina and its port of Yanbu, we see two things. Below Yanbu is an unlabeled city, and Medina itself is labeled Medina Tel-Nabi, which is a Latinized version of the Arabic Madinat an-Nabi, the city of the prophet. Well, Ortelius was either confused or bothered by the blank spot because just 5 years later he's moved Tel-Nabi down to cover the unlabeled city, thus inventing a new place name. Moving to the end of the 16th century, we have this Lindschoten map, which represents a different school of cartography. The map is probably the first detailed navigational chart for the Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean, and in this way illustrates an important aspect of 16th century cartography. As you know, calculating longitude accurately was over a century away, but that doesn't mean that longitudinal data wasn't being generated by estimating distances and reading the stars. The problem was that this data didn't always fit the Ptolemaic grid. As a result, two different types of maps were developed in the 16th century, reflected by different titles. The first type of map is what we have seen so far, called a cosmographia or tabula. The other type was compiled in the Portolan tradition, and was often titled a carta marina, and is easily recognizable by a compass rose and radiating lines. These two types often came in pairs, a classic example being Waldseemüller's 1507 Universalis Cosmographia and the 1516 Carta Marina, but one need not turn to such an iconic example. This was very common in 16th century map publishing. As we move into the 17th century, we see developments in both cartography and in European links to Arabia. Serious competition between European powers and between Europe and the Ottoman Empire for access to the waters around the Arabian Peninsula led to new map-making efforts. This lovely map by Sanson was the first large map of the century devoted to Arabia, and the importance of this map is seen in the number of new urban centers labeled with contemporary names. This is especially true in the center of the Arabian Peninsula, and if we begin to connect the dots, we can see the first indications of the travel and pilgrimage routes on the peninsula, to and from Mecca and Medina, Damascus, Baghdad, Basra, Yemen, and more. Now, if we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, we see how little inland topography has improved in the centuries since Gastaldi, and realize that inland Arabia was one of the great frontiers. Here we are in 1654, and we still have no depiction of the basic geography of the interior. To put this into perspective, think about the immense cartographic changes that took place elsewhere during this time. Entire continents were being redrawn on the other side of the world, and yet we still have basic errors for Arabia. Take this 17th century nautical map with the insets of East African ports and Socotra, for example. The map is quite important for its new coastal detail of Arabia, and yet if we zoom in, we see a major lacuna, namely that the Sinai Peninsula is completely missing. At the north end of the Red Sea, it should split into the Gulf of Suez to the left and the Gulf of Aqaba to the right, forming the Sinai. It's a big feature, the land bridge between Asia and Africa, and yet we don't see it at all on these maps. It's difficult to say exactly what's going on here. The first thought might be that it was unknown, but in fact the Sinai was well known in antiquity, and we see indications of it on the Roman Peutinger table, early Ptolemaic maps, the medieval Catalan Atlas, and Idrisi. Unfortunately, there is no obvious chronological typology, in part because different map makers are copying different models and copying each other in different ways. So when do we start to get Arabia right? Well, like for the mapping of much of the world, things start to change in the early 18th century, when you get this sort of wave of enlightenment in cartography, with state or institution-sponsored surveys and expeditions. It is this map by D'Anville that represents the shift to the new era. D'Anville was royal geographer to Louis XV, And as the French Navy sought to exert control over the Red Sea, he was tasked with improving maps of Arabia. He pored over countless sources. He was intensely interested in the classical geographers, and it was his comparison of their work with that of Arab geographers and European travelers that gave him a clearer view of the peninsula than his predecessors. He also mentions manuscript material at his disposal. Basically, he had royal financial backing to do the costly compilation work we have discussed earlier. The result is a much more accurate inland map. The western coast is fairly detailed from the Hejaz down to Yemen. Important places have been put into position mainly from Arabic sources. 2 centuries after Gastaldi used mountains to divide his regions, the spurious mountain systems are gone, most notably in the empty quarter, which is left blank. Information on tribal groups has been inserted, and old incense trails and pilgrimage routes of travel are delineated. Most importantly, it was the production of this map which demonstrated to the Western world its ignorance of inland Arabia. The desire to correct this ignorance led to the expedition of Carsten Niebuhr of the 1760s. Niebuhr was a German mathematician, cartographer, and explorer. He was a member of the Danish Expedition, the first truly scientific mission to the Arabian Peninsula. From the moment of the expedition's departure in January 1761, the governments and universities of Europe followed its progress with fascination. Niebuhr and 4 companions reached Yemen a year later, not knowing that in the end Niebuhr would be the sole survivor, which he was able to do in part by adopting local dress and eating local food. From a scientific point of view, the expedition was a major success, producing detailed maps of the southwestern parts of the Arabian Peninsula, along with city plans and this nautical map, which covers the Red Sea from Suez to the Gulf of Aden. Overall, the expedition's findings constituted a major leap forward in European knowledge of Arabia, and these maps are thus a landmark pivot point for the story of its mapping, and represent a broader shift in the history of cartography in general. Thanks for watching. More information at neatlinemaps.com.